Russia isn't strong, it's weak. The economy is tottering. There are these incredible casualty numbers. They've run out of tanks and armored vehicles. Their income from gas sales has plummeted. And, even with rather half-hearted US support and the European efforts, Ukraine has fought Russia to a standstill. So this war is really on a knife edge. And if Ukraine gets full-hearted support from the EU and the UK, it can actually win this war. It could win it quite easily.
Just to pick up on something you said about the great diplomacy the Europeans have exercised in recent days, I'm really interested to get your take on that a bit more, because you could argue that the lack of progress to date has been down to the fact of the over-reliance on Donald Trump as the peace broker.
Yes, it's a very good question. I think when I praise European diplomacy, I'm really talking about a couple of things. One is the fact that they have been staying together. They've been showing solidarity between the EU and the UK, and they've continued to help Ukraine. And that's not self-evident that you should see such unity from the Europeans for 3 years. So that's great diplomacy. And then there's good diplomacy to pressure Donald Trump and to try and get him to take a less pro-Russian approach. That's good diplomacy too. And then ending the war, that's the really big piece of diplomacy. And as I was saying before, I think to achieve that, you really need to get Russia to change its position, to take an interest in peace, because up to now, Putin seems to believe that if he keeps grinding forward with these terribly destructive meat grinder assaults, sacrificing maybe 1,000 Russian soldiers every day in the war against Ukraine, Putin seems to think he's going to win. So why should he negotiate? Now, when Donald Trump starts acting peace broker, it's a bit of a two-edged sword. On the one hand, when he takes an interest in the issue, suddenly the world takes notice. And I really notice this, that often you'll have days or weeks or months where the war in Ukraine goes on with these thousands of soldiers dying every week, and the world doesn't pay much attention. But when Donald Trump starts trying to solve it, usually with some kind of measure that we don't quite know what he's trying to do, and it feels very pro-Russian, but when he takes an interest, suddenly the world gets involved. And that is good, because we need strong support for Ukraine. We need the world to take an interest in this to bring it to a ceasefire, or ideally to some kind of peace deal. I mean, you may remember back in February, the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth suddenly said, Ukraine is never going to get all its land back, and it's never going to join NATO. This was before there had even been any negotiations at all. A really bizarre way to go around about negotiating something, to give your opponent everything they want before the negotiations start. But what Hegseth was basically saying, and I think this sentiment has quite a bit of support in the US, is why don't the Europeans do more? And basically the US wanted to dump this whole war in Europe's lap. And so I think the formation of this coalition of the willing that has come about to support Ukraine and to enforce any ceasefire is a really good thing. And again, if we're talking about diplomacy, that's another pretty successful initiative.
And on that subject, the EU is meeting in Brussels now, and President Zelensky is there. There's going to be a coalition of the meeting, a willing meeting in London tomorrow. And the Kyiv Independent has been calling for it to do what is really needed, end the war by decisively breaking Russia's conviction that it can break Ukraine and get away with it. How does Europe add momentum to this moment?
I think it's worth bearing in mind that Russia, like any country which launches a war, likes to portray itself as being indomitable, will never be influenced by anything. But actually, Russia isn't strong. It's weak. The economy is tottering. There are these incredible casualty numbers. They've run out of tanks and armored vehicles. Their income from gas sales has plummeted. And even with rather half-hearted US support and the European efforts, Ukraine has fought Russia to a standstill. So this war is really on a knife edge. And if Ukraine gets full-hearted support from the EU and the UK, it can actually win this war. It could win it quite easily if it had wholehearted US support. But the key point here, Kate, is that for Europe, including the UK, to provide the support that Ukraine needs is not easy. It takes time to build up defense industries. There's been this story of it taking over a year to build a factory to make 155 millimeter shells, which are something the Ukrainians need desperately. More than that, helping Ukraine to defend itself takes money away from other areas that are really important to voters, such as, I don't know, funding the NHS or social security payments. So it's really important that European governments and this coalition of the willing, all of those governments, plus the UK, of course, explain to voters why helping Ukraine is important for their security. It's also vital, actually, for US security. And it's so important that Russia doesn't win this war, because if Russia does win this war, it's a disaster for all of our security, because of the principle of territorial integrity.
How far do you think that releasing that $140 billion loan from frozen Russian assets will go in practical terms, but also in sending a message to Moscow?
It's this money that Russia has had deposited in the EU, in Belgium, I think most of it is, and you can harvest money from that because there would be interest payments and so on. And so it's been proposed that the EU should use 140 billion taken from that Russian money to help Ukraine. And this is a very significant sum. If we look at US support to Ukraine since February 2022, when Russia did its full-scale invasion, it adds up to around $130 billion, or support from the UK and the EU over the same period, around $170 billion. So that money is really important in a substantive fashion. And then, as you say, Kate, it's also a very important political message of support, because Putin hopes that eventually Europe will run out of energy, will run out of money, will just run out of enthusiasm, and Russia will win. And what this does, to quote the EU's chief diplomat, Kaja Kallas, she said this week, liberating this $140 million to help Ukraine sends a critical message to Russia: you can't outlast us. Ukraine desperately needs that money, and I think it will make a real difference.
This editorial in the Kyiv Independent argued that another step that needs to be taken, it's saying now, is direct European military presence in Ukraine, with or without a ceasefire. Not when there's a ceasefire, if there's a ceasefire, but even now. Do you agree with that?
I can see why the Kyiv Independent is saying that. I like the Kyiv Independent. It's a great newspaper. It's been fighting Ukraine's corner in very difficult circumstances for many, many years. However, I think we're a long way from having EU or US forces involved in combat against Russia in Ukraine. And what's the reason? First of all, I don't think that most people in European countries or in the US would support deploying their own militaries in those countries. And secondly, while I think that a lot of fears of escalation are overblown, and of course Russia will always threaten use of its nuclear missiles if Ukraine is given all kinds of new supports. They talked about it with F-16s, they talked about it with Challenger tanks and Leopard tanks and so on, and they've never done anything. But at the same time, for our troops to get involved in fighting in Ukraine would place us directly into a war with Russia. And that's a place that most people so far don't think we should be in. I'd agree with that.
I just want to draw on your career as a diplomat, and you were British ambassador to Kyiv until 2012. Can you just explain the political climate in Ukraine at that time? Because you were right between the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan Revolution, weren't you?
Yes, absolutely. It was a huge privilege, of course, to be British ambassador to Ukraine. It's a huge privilege to be British ambassador to anywhere. And Ukraine is clearly a country, it was then and it is now, whose future will be critical to the future of the whole region. It was then a country full of hope and ambition. The overwhelming majority of Ukrainians want Ukraine to be a normal country, not one that is a sort of clone of Soviet-era Russia or Ukraine. And they want to jettison the Soviet past. So all of that was in play. And it's very striking if you go and live in Ukraine. When I went there as ambassador in 2008, it was my first ever visit to Ukraine. I'd served in Moscow in the 1990s in the embassy there. And I was really struck by the fact it's a completely different place from Russia. It's very diverse linguistically. It has a Russian-speaking minority, big Russian-speaking minority. It has Hungarians, Tatars. It's very common to hear radio and TV interviews, or it was then, where one person was speaking Russian and the other one was speaking Ukrainian. Language just wasn't an issue. And I traveled very widely in those days, including to Crimea and Donetsk and Mariupol, all these areas now occupied by Russia. And I never once met a single person who wanted their regions to be part of Russia. I remember in Crimea, a Ukrainian taxi driver who drove me around for the day and took me to see the sights. He was actually a former sailor in the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. And I remember asking him, there was a controversy at the time about whether street signs in Crimea should be in Ukrainian or in Russian or in both. And he said, well, I don't mind, things are fine as they are. So even that person who was, you might have expected to be quite pro-Russian, was completely relaxed about it. And it was a country of immense hope. And I think then nobody would have expected Russia to invade. That just seemed to be completely off the board.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.